Have you ever sat across from someone at a family dinner, watched them pour wine and laugh at their own jokes, and known, absolutely known, that they had stolen from your mother while she was still in the hospital bed? I have, and I smiled. I passed the bread. I asked my brother-in-law how his golf game was going, because I had already decided I was going to let him finish what he started. I just wasn't going to let him keep it. My mom was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's in the spring, 2 years before she died. She was 61, sharp as anything, still working part-time at the credit union in Barrie, still doing her crosswords in pen. The tremors started in her right hand, then her left. By the time she retired, walking across the kitchen had become something she had to think about. My brother-in-law, my sister's husband, Evan, had been around our family for almost 15 years by then. He was the kind of man who knew exactly what to say at funerals and exactly what to do with other people's money. He worked in private wealth management in Toronto, had an office on King Street, wore the kind of suits that made my mom say, "Well, doesn't he look important?" every single time, even after a decade of seeing him in them. She meant it as a compliment. She always did. When Mom's condition progressed and it became harder for her to manage her own accounts, she asked Evan to help. Not because he was the most qualified person she knew. I was a paralegal. I'd been working state files for 6 years. I could have done it. But because she didn't want to burden me. That was my mom. She would carry a broken wrist for 3 days before she'd ask you to drive her to the clinic. Evan had power of attorney for her finances within 4 months of that conversation. I didn't know the full scope of what that meant until much later. At the time, my sister told me and I said, "Okay, that makes sense." And I went home and made dinner and didn't think about it again for almost a year. My mom died in February, a Tuesday. The kind of flat, gray Ontario Tuesday that feels like it was designed specifically for bad news. My sister called me from the hospital and I drove there in sleet, and by the time I arrived, she was already gone. The will was read 3 weeks later. Mom had left the house in Barrie, her RSP savings, and a small investment account, roughly $340,000 combined, to be split evenly between my sister and me. Not a complicated estate, she'd done everything right. But the investment account had $12,000 in it. 18 months earlier, the last time I'd helped Mom with some paperwork, she'd mentioned it had just crossed her $180,000. I asked Evan about it at the will reading, quietly, standing by the window while the lawyer shuffled papers. He said the market had been rough. He said she'd made some changes he tried to advise against. He said it in the tone of a man who had rehearsed exactly this conversation and was very comfortable having it. I nodded. I said, "Right, of course." I went home. I sat at my kitchen table in Oshawa for 2 hours, and I thought about my mother, and I thought about that number, and I thought about Evan's voice when he said she'd made some changes. My mom had Parkinson's. She had a good mind until near the end, but the end came quickly. She had not been making aggressive investment decisions in the last year of her life. She had been trying to remember which drawer she kept the dish towels in. I didn't say anything to my sister. Not yet. Meg and Evan had been married for 11 years. They had 2 kids. They had a mortgage on a house in Oakville that I knew, from things Meg had let slip over the years, was significantly more than they could comfortably afford. I loved my sister. I also knew that if I said the wrong thing too soon, the first call she'd make would be to Evan. So I did what I do. I went back to work and I started pulling on threads. As a paralegal, I have access to certain public records that most people don't think to look for. Land registry, corporate filings, court records. I'm not an investigator and I'm never going to pretend otherwise. But I know how documents work and I know what a paper trail looks like when someone's tried to erase it. The first thing I found was a numbered company registered in Ontario, 2001-147-391, Ontario Inc., with a registration date of 14 months before my mom died. The sole director was a number holding company based in Alberta. It took me 3 weeks of evenings and weekends to trace the Alberta holding company back to a name I recognized, Evan's mother. I sat with that for a long time. Then I pulled Mom's bank records. She had named me executor, so I had full legal access, and I cross-referenced every transfer out of her investment account over the 18-month period Evan had pulled. There were 11 transfers. 3 of them went to the numbered company. Together, they totaled just over $94,000. He hadn't even been creative about it. The transfers were labeled investment advisory fees and portfolio management external. Standard-looking enough that a grieving family wouldn't question them. Not standard enough to survive 30 seconds of scrutiny from someone who'd spent 6 years reading estate files. I printed everything. I bought a package of file folders from the Staples on Taunton Road and I labeled each one and I built a binder. Then I called a lawyer I knew, not a friend, a colleague I trusted. And I asked her to review what I had. She called me back the next morning and told me to come in that afternoon. "This is fraud," she said, before she'd even fully closed her office door. "This is elder financial abuse under the criminal code. And depending on what else is in these accounts, this might also be a breach of fiduciary duty that could expose him professionally. His license, his registration with IORO, everything." I asked her what we should do. She said we could report to the police, pursue a civil claim against Evan personally, and file a complaint with the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada. We could do all three simultaneously. I asked her how long it would take. She said, to do it properly, a few months, but you'll want to gather everything first. I said fine. I went home and I gathered everything first. I want to be honest about what the next 4 months felt like, because I think people imagine this kind of thing is driven by rage and clarity. It wasn't for me. I was mostly just tired and sad. I missed my mom. I would come home from work and open the binder and look at the transfer records and think about her hands shaking while she tried to sign her name, and I'd have to close the binder and make tea and stand at the window for a while before I could keep going. But I kept going. Thanksgiving came. My sister had it at her house in Oakville. I drove down and I sat at the table and I watched Evan carve the turkey and make everyone laugh and pour too much wine into his own glass. And I felt something settle in my chest that I didn't have a name for. Not anger exactly, not calm exactly, something in between. After dinner, Evan asked me how work was going. I told him it was fine. I said I've been doing a lot of estate files lately. He nodded and said, "Good field, lots of work with the boomers aging out." And I laughed and said, "Yeah, exactly." And then I went and helped Meg do the dishes. By December, I had everything. Full transaction history, corporate records, expert opinion from a forensic accountant in Mississauga who wrote a 12-page report concluding that the transfers represented a clear pattern of self-dealing and misappropriation. I had a signed statement from Mom's GP confirming her cognitive state during the period in question. I had screenshots of the numbered company's filing showing Evan's mother as director, and a sworn affidavit connecting that company to Evan through a separate investment account he'd disclosed during their mortgage application 3 years earlier. Public record, if you know where to look. I filed the police report on Wednesday afternoon in December, right before Christmas. I filed the IWRT complaint the same day. My lawyer filed the civil claim 2 days later. I did not tell my sister beforehand. That is the part of this I've thought about the most. Whether I should have told her, whether she deserved to hear it from me first, in private, before it became official. I've turned it over in my head more times than I can count, and I still don't have a clean answer. What I know is that Meg had been living with this man for 11 years. What I know is that she'd already lost her mother. What I know is that if I told her first, I don't think she could have kept it from him. And I know what would have disappeared if he'd had 48 hours of warning. She found out when a detective called her on a Thursday morning to ask if she was available to speak to someone from the fraud unit. She called me 20 minutes later. She was crying and she was screaming, and she was using words I'd never heard her direct at me before. I let her go. I didn't interrupt. When she stopped, I said, "Meg, have everything. Let me send you the file." She didn't respond for 2 days. The civil hearing was in March at the Superior Court in Toronto. Evan had a lawyer, a good one, Bay Street, the kind of firm that charges by the 6-minute increment. His position was that my mother had instructed the transfers, that she'd been of sound mind, and that the advisory fees were a legitimate contractual arrangement pre-authorized by her in writing. He produced a document, a fee authorization signed by my mother dated 8 months before she died. I looked at the signature. I had seen my mother's signature on 100 documents. This was close. But my mother had a particular way of looping the H in her last name, Harwood, a small habit she'd had since she was a teenager, something she'd mentioned to me once when she was teaching me to sign my own name. The H on this document was printed, flat. It looked like someone who had studied her signature carefully and reproduced most of it. I passed a note to my lawyer. She requested a document examination. The judge granted it. The forensic document examiner's report came back 6 weeks later. The signature was inconsistent with a sample set of 43 authenticated documents signed by my mother over the previous decade. The paper fiber itself showed trace chemical compounds consistent with the process used to age documents artificially, something the examiner said she'd seen before in fabricated estate documents. Evan's lawyer asked for an adjournment. The judge denied it. We came back the following week. I sat in that courtroom in a gray blazer my mom had bought me 2 Christmases ago, and I watched Evan sit very still at the respondent's table while his lawyer spoke in careful, measured sentences that slowly stopped making sense. Because the thing about fabricating a document is that once the document falls, everything built on top of it falls too. She instructed me. She pre-authorized. She understood the fees. All of it was resting on that signature, and the signature was gone. The judge asked Evan directly whether he had prepared the fee authorization document himself. Evan said he'd had it prepared by a third party. The judge asked him to identify the third party. Evan said he didn't recall. The judge looked at him for a long moment, took off his glasses, set them on the desk in front of him, and said, "Mr. Harwood, you are telling this court that a document central to your defense was prepared by a person whose name you cannot recall in connection with funds belonging to a woman who was in the late stages of a neurological illness. Do you understand how that sounds?" Evan's lawyer started to speak. The judge held up one hand. "I didn't cry. I told myself I wouldn't, and I didn't. I looked at my hands and I thought about my mom's handwriting and I held it together." The court ordered full restitution of the $94,000 plus interest, plus costs. The judge referred the matter to the Crown for consideration of criminal charges. He also made a separate order that his decision be forwarded to 2IROC, noting that the conduct in question raised serious concerns about the respondent's fitness to manage the financial affairs of vulnerable clients. Evan's license was suspended pending review within 3 weeks. My sister and I didn't speak for 4 months after the hearing. When she finally called, it was a Sunday evening in July. She said she'd been going through their finances and had found things she hadn't known about. Not just my mom's money, other things. She said it in the quiet, flat voice of someone who has been crying so much they've run out of a specific kind of tears and moved on to a different kind. I drove to Oakville that night. I brought groceries because I didn't know what else to do. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Evan had held court at Thanksgiving, pouring wine, laughing too loud, and we talked until 2 in the morning. She asked me why I hadn't told her before I filed. I told her the truth. I said I was afraid that if I told her, I'd lose the evidence. And I said I was also afraid that if I told you, I'd lose you, and I couldn't figure out how to protect both at the same time, so I chose the one that couldn't choose for itself. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said Mom would have hated all of this. I said, yeah, she would have. We sat there for a while in the quiet, and I thought about my mom and her crosswords and her dish towels and the way she used to sign her name with that loop in the H. And I thought about how she trusted someone with the most vulnerable part of her life and how he'd looked at that vulnerability and seen an opportunity. The money didn't bring her back. Obviously, the money barely mattered in the end. We donated most of what was recovered to a Parkinson's support organization in Barrie, which felt like the only right thing to do with it. What mattered was the other thing. The thing that's harder to explain to people who haven't been through it. When someone betrays a person you love, when they wait until that person is sick and frightened and trusting, there's a particular kind of wrong that sits in you like a stone. It doesn't go away when you win, but it gets lighter. It gets lighter when the judge takes off his glasses and says, out loud in a room full of people, that he sees exactly what happened. He played it like a financial instrument. I played it like a paper trail. The paper trail won. I still think about the binder sometimes. The Staples file folders, the printed transfer records, the sticky notes I used to flag each irregularity. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even satisfying to build. Most nights, it was just me at my kitchen table in Oshawa, tired after work, missing my mom, doing the only thing I knew how to do. I think that's the part people don't tell you about when something like this happens to your family. There's no clear moment where you decide to fight back. They're just a slow accumulation of small decisions. To open the binder again instead of closing it. To make one more phone call. To get up the next morning and keep going even when the grief and the paperwork feel equally exhausting. Evan had every structural advantage. He had credentials, a Bay Street lawyer, a fabricated document, and 11 years of being trusted by people who loved him. What he didn't account for was that the person he'd stolen from had raised a daughter who understood how paper trails work. My mom spent 30 years at a credit union teaching people to read the fine print. I think about that a lot. The way her carefulness lived on in me, even after she was gone. I've heard people call what I did revenge. I don't think of it that way. Revenge is emotional. It's about making someone feel what you felt. What I did was closer to accounting. I found the missing money. I traced it back to its source. I presented the evidence to people with the authority to act on it. What happened to Evan after that was just consequence catching up with cause. That's the thing about integrity. The real kind, not the performance of it. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in how carefully you document something when no one is watching. It shows up in the decision to do the harder right thing instead of the easier, quiet thing. Ethan had every opportunity to be a man worth trusting. He had a sick woman's confidence in her finances and her vulnerability, and he chose to treat all of it like an opportunity. That choice had a shape. It left evidence. It led somewhere specific. What I want anyone going through something like this to hold on to is that clarity matters more than speed. I watched for months while Evan carved turkeys and poured wine and believed he'd gotten away with it. That patience wasn't passivity, it was strategy, and it came from understanding that emotional intelligence, knowing when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to let someone keep digging, is as important as any legal argument you'll ever make in a courtroom. My mom used to say that the people who last are the ones who do the work when it's hard and unglamorous and nobody's watching. She was talking about her garden, I think. But she was right about everything else, too. The paper trail won. She would have appreciated that.